I know the feeling. Oh, just a question before we start. We have a second presentation. It's hard to create something people use, reflection on creating and sustaining a data lifecycle management toolkit. Is there anyone here giving that presentation? No, doesn't seem like it. And I haven't heard from anybody, so it's a bit... I think we might just jump it then and have a little more time. Yes, I think we will start. And as just kind of announced, I'm looking for someone for the second presentation, and I think they might not be here. So that gives, oh, I see someone online. So we have a virtual presentation, I guess. Rachel, can you knock? I can see you, the others can't. You're presenting? Just I take it as a yes. So we have one more virtual presentation that gives us one face-to-face presentation and 3 virtual presentations. So first of all, welcome to this session on data access, governance and ethics. We have 4 presentations, 3 virtual and 1 here at stage. Just my name is Fink. I'm from the DAC, Danish E-Infrastructure Corporation, working in Denmark. I wanted to chair this session because I thought the presentations were really interesting. So that was sort of my reason for being here. To the presenters, we have approximately 20 minutes for each, so please aim at 15 minutes for presentation. Then we have some minutes for questions. I'll try to put a hand up when you have had your 15 minutes. I'm very bad at these things about keeping time, so anybody, please help. And I hope the hand will help for virtual presenters too. And I think this might be a bit easier to keep track of time sitting behind a screen. For you as participants, please keep your questions to the end of each presentation. And if we have time left in the end of the whole session after the 4 presentation, we can have more questions and even maybe some that cuts across the 4 presentation. Firstly, today I'll give the floor to Allison Taina in a little while. Just a little bio on Allison. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan School of Information. For the last year, she has been at Gdpr in Cologne, Germany, on a Fulbright Human Research grant to complete her dissertation research investigating the impact of the GDPR on 4 European Union social science data archives. She has also previously conducted research with ICPSR on their Researchers' Passport project and on studies of the impact of curation activities on data reuse. Super interesting that you're doing things on GDPR. So the floor is yours, Allison.
All right, so thank you very much for that introduction. As she said, my name is Allison Taina. I'm a sixth-year PhD candidate at the University of Michigan School of Information. I will hopefully be defending my dissertation later this summer, which will be really nice. And so today I'll be presenting to you just a small portion of my dissertation research. And so what I'll be going over today, I will briefly describe the background of this project, my research design, some of the more significant findings, and the key takeaways. And so my initial motivation for my research came out of an unanswered question from that researcher passport project I did with ICPSR. And I had interviewed representatives at European, American, and Australian data archives. And during the European interviews, I'd asked the interviewees just what they thought might happen at their archives because of the GDPR. And at the time of those interviews, which were about a year or so before the full implementation deadline in May 2018, nobody really had an answer. And so that was a question that stayed with me even after my work on that project ended. However, I'm also interested in the GDPR itself because of how, in order to take part in the global data economy, the number of countries that have been implementing their own data protection laws or considering it in the last several years has increased dramatically. And I think that the lessons learned at the European Union-based archives that had to respond to the GDPR may prove insightful for archives and researchers elsewhere. So this research is also motivated more broadly by several events and innovations of the last several decades, including just the general increased emphasis on collaborative research, the growing recognition of privacy risks of digital data, the significant advancements in communication and data processing technology, as well as the growth in number of digital data repositories and archives, somewhat culminating in 2016 with the General Data Protection Regulation. And so the GDPR, the aims of it, according to Article 1, are to both protect the fundamental right of personal data protection and promote the free movement of personal data within the EU. And going into my research, I thought that this would be somewhat tricky for data archives as they try to balance their mission to make research data available for reuse with their responsibilities to their data subjects. And I focused my research on social science data archives in particular because, particularly at the time that I was developing my research methodology, the impact on these particular archives was not something that had been heavily discussed in the literature, particularly when you look at medical and health-related research at the time. And this was despite the very well-known privacy risks recognized about the data that are collected and used by social science researchers. So I hope that my research in this area does contribute further to this discussion. Now, my dissertation does have two broad aims. The first was to just understand the operational impacts and changes at the archives. And the second was to develop and test a model of informational privacy, specifically for the context of data archives. And this presentation is going to focus primarily on this first aim, but I will briefly discuss my theoretical model just because it does structure how I approached my analysis. So the most common definition of informational privacy was provided by Clark 2016 as the interest that an individual has in controlling or at least significantly influencing the handling of data about themselves. However, I found this definition to be insufficient in the context of data archives and research data about people, because those personal data become several steps removed from the data subject, first being given to the researcher, then to an archive, and then to a user. And so I reconceptualized how I was looking at informational privacy, instead to be something that was interwoven into, but also resulting from three different concepts of privacy that I found in my literature review. And the first is the idea of privacy as a way of regulating information flows. And this draws heavily on Nissenbaum's theory of contextual integrity, where privacy violations occur when that information flows in ways outside of the original context or the agreed upon context. And the second was what I refer to as privacy as protection from harm, which draws heavily on Solovey's taxonomy of privacy violations. And then the third dimension here is privacy in response to technological advancement, which, despite the age of this article, draws heavily on Warren and Brandeis's 1890 argument that privacy was a right to be let alone by advanced technologies. So I use all three of these to frame how I looked at the archives in my study. So my dissertation is a multiple case comparative case study of the Czech Social Science Data Archive, DONS, the Finnish Social Science Data Archive, and CESSDA. And I had three primary data sources for my dissertation. The first was 41 in-depth semi-structured interviews with 42 respondents across all 4 archives, where I interviewed archive leadership and decision makers, members of the IT and legal staff, other staff working both with the archive data and in other services, as well as stakeholders who had influence or insight into long-term strategic planning. And these interviews were coded and analyzed in vivo. And the questions that I asked focused on just what the changes were and what the respondents' perspectives on the changes and challenges that they faced. I also reviewed documentation such as deposit agreements, privacy policies, anonymization standards, guidelines in terms of use, both from before and after the GDPR, so that I could see how the changes that my interviewees discussed were actually reflected in the policies. And my third source of data were the archive usage statistics, which provided a way to see the practical implications of the GDPR on the actual archive operations without solely relying on the interviewees' perceptions. And the data I used came from 3 sources: publicly available published data sets, data that I requested from the archives, and data that I aggregated from formal reports. Now, here's just a selection of the criteria that I considered when choosing my 4 cases. This is not all inclusive. There were other criteria. And so when it comes to social science data archives, they generally work with data applicable to research in a variety of disciplines. And so I did look at more than just what disciplines they were interested in or that they supported. And my intention was to try to maximize the differences that I thought might be relevant when looking at the experiences of these 4 archives, particularly in terms of size, either in terms of number of staff or number of data sets, whether they offered some form of access to restricted data, what their access conditions were, and what their institutional affiliations were. Now, I'm more than happy to answer questions on those criteria at the end. So shifting to my findings, the important decision that had to be made at each institution was whether and for which processes and data the institution would be the controller or the processor. And under the GDPR, the controller is the party that determines the purposes and means of processing and is responsible for demonstrating compliance, while the processor processes the personal data on behalf of and only under the direction of the controller. However, as I found in my dissertation, there is some blurring of these roles at each of the archives. Now, in terms of which decision they made, I'm only going to talk here about the data archive services at the institutions. And I just want to note that the other services and personal data that the archives work with don't necessarily reflect the same decisions. They were very situationally based. So to begin with the 2 archives that chose the role of processor, FSD has historically only archived anonymous data, with the exception of certain data that were archived under a public interest exemption. However, since the GDPR came into effect, the Finnish archive has begun working with pseudonymized data, which do fall under the GDPR, and they acknowledge that they come across personal data in supposedly anonymized data sets, which makes them now processing personal data. So they determined that the processor role was appropriate. As with the Finnish archive, DANS is currently the processor for its data archive easy, continuing the pre-GDPR practice regarding the research data where it was the data provider who determined who and under what conditions could access the data. However, this was not a simple decision and is one area where DANS and its parent organization, the CONAVE, have disagreed, and this will come back later in the presentation. IASSIST was the only archive to decide to be the controller for the research data in its 2 archives, the data archive and the self-archiving datorium. And this decision was because IASSIST staff did not want to be the processor and be responsible for correcting errors in the data. And as one of the IASSIST interviewees described it, they refrained from handling personal data because that would make us a processor and they would be in a different legal position. Now, of the 4 archives in my case study, only the Czech archive does not actually have a role under the GDPR. And the reasoning behind this is that they only archive anonymous data, with the exception of certain Institute of Sociology, their parent organizations, research, which are only available internal to the Institute and only to Institute researchers. And so they did not choose a role for their archive data, which they did acknowledge during the interviews may be a challenge when they curate data sets and find personal data. However, other aspects of their operations did have to respond to the GDPR, which is why I continue to include them in my dissertation because of other ongoing changes at the archive. Now, from the decision to be processor or controller, I turn to just what actually happened at the archive. And despite everything you see on the slide, I will not be talking about everything. But during my analysis, I began to sort the changes I was seeing into the different aspects of privacy in my model. And I did this both by looking at what the changes actually were and how my respondents were describing them. And so the changes here are also not inclusive of every change made in every category, but the ones that I found particularly relevant. So beginning with changes that relate to managing the flow of data into and out of the archive. All 4 archives made changes to their deposit review processes, and they primarily talked about this as being just more strict in terms of what they were reviewing for. They all considered that their processes to begin with before the GDPR were very well established and sufficient, but they just wanted to be kind of more aware of what they were doing. For those of you who saw Anya Perry's discussion yesterday about the study of the data curation timeline, IASSIST did make additional changes last year to their curation processes and what they look for and how kind of in depth they do it. And that's part of what she talked about in her presentation. So there are still ongoing kind of changes and adjustments even now. The next change I want to talk about is just one that applies to DONS, but I find it really interesting. Of all the 4 archives, DONS is the only one that, in addition to a deposit agreement, had an additional form that data providers have to fill out before they deposit their data. And the change that they made here was to ask a mandatory question of whether or not there were personal data in the data deposit, and how the data provider answers this question kind of triggers a number of additional changes that occur that were implemented because of the GDPR. One of those being the processing agreement. So the 2 processors, DONS and FSD, were the only data archives to implement some sort of processing agreement that dictates just what processing work they will do to the data. However, they did do this through 2 different approaches. DONS applies the processing agreement only to data that indicate that they have personal data in them, either by a yes on that deposit form question, or if during the curation process they encounter what may be personal data, at which point they will just stop the processing and negotiate the processing agreement. However, at FSD, they had found over the last many years that even when the data providers said that their data were anonymous, that they actually weren't. So they just have implemented this requirement for all data deposits, no matter what. Now, the changes that reflect the goal of minimizing potential privacy harms to data subjects were primarily related to ensuring that the data subjects were aware of what their rights were, and also moderating access to the data. And here I'm going to focus on just one of these, and this was the requirement to confirm that the data subjects had actually consented to data archiving. And so in addition to taking part of the research, in the research project itself, they knew that their data were going somewhere. And so at these 3 archives, in slightly different situations, they require a copy of the informed consent form to be provided with the data deposit. And when reviewing the documentation, the archive staff will look for whether or not the language of the consent form indicates that the data will only be used for the original project, or anything else that indicates that the data should not actually be going to an archive. And I really should have DONS on the slide for this one, because they did actually make a change here, but the change was not to make this a priority, but actually to remove this as a requirement. So it's the only archive of my 4 that actually removed a requirement for consent for archiving. And you see this mainly just by looking at the privacy policies from 2009 and 2018 at DONS. In 2009, they did require that the data providers confirm through the provision of a consent form that data subjects had consented to archiving. However, because of the decision that DONS made to be processor, unlike what happened at FSD, DONS has decided that they don't need this proof because that's not part of their role as processor. And I just thought that was an interesting difference of opinion. Now, the changes reflecting concerns over technological risks to privacy were found mainly in how the archives approached data protection measures and training. And not all changes here were directly because of the GDPR. So I will just highlight that all 4 archives either created or heavily revised their training materials in terms of data protection and research data management. And they were also frequently asked to provide this training, not just internally, but to their parent organizations or to external researchers. Now, in addition to those policy and practice changes that align well with my model, there were several other changes that focused more on managing data protection at the archives, specifically at FSD and the Czech archive. They established the data protection officer role. FSD did already have somebody informally in this position, and it was just a matter of formalizing it. DONS and GASIS already had data protection officers that they could consult. So what they did instead was establish a privacy coordinator role specifically to support data protection at specific levels. At DONS, this role was actually mandated by the parent organization, and it was there to support the data protection of administrative data, while at GASIS, this role will be to support the research data side. Additionally, there are a number of changes that the archives feel remain to be made in order to maintain or reach GDPR compliance. And I just want to highlight here that the processor versus controller decision is one not set in stone, and this is something ongoing at DONS. Now, operationally, the GDPR was not seen as something significantly affecting the use of the archives as data archives, whether in terms of data set publication or data set downloads. I'll note here that DONS's rapid increase in data set publications per year is actually due to a machine-to-machine transfer system and not a lot of people just being really excited to deposit their data after the GDPR. And of them, or of the 4 archives, only GASIS and the Czech archive hypothesized that changes might be due to researcher hesitation around data archiving, but they did not look further into this. And so it's mainly hypothetical at this point. And as I said, there were similarly no significant changes due to data downloads. Instead, when asked what they felt was the most significant impact of the GDPR on their archives, the interviewees identified a variety of outcomes, the top 3 being this increased awareness and caution around data protection, the increased focus on data subject rights, and for FSD and DONS in particular, the establishment of this privacy agreement requirement. Now, the archives did face a number of challenges during the GDPR transition period. I will highlight 2 here. And many challenges stem just from the delays in the national implementation laws, particularly for DONS, which does still not consider itself to be fully compliant because it had to wait for the law to come into effect in order for its parent organization to determine what its priorities were, which only then enabled DONS to actually finalize its own priorities. Something similar happened at the Czech archive. And the other one is that both the Czech archive, DONS, and GASIS all highlighted a lack of internal or parent organizational legal and research data, or expertise in legal and research data aspects of data protection, which limited their ability to seek advice and actually put the archive in the position of being that person that others came to asking for advice, increasing their own administrative and bureaucratic burdens. So in summary, what I found in my dissertation, which I very briefly and quickly went through, is that there were actually a high level of commonality in terms of where changes were made across the 4 archives. The differences really lay in the details. There were some measurable operational changes, but they could not be directly tied to the GDPR. And instead, the most significant impacts and outcomes were actually in the mindset of the archive staff, as well as a particular type of operational requirement, the processing agreement. And there were also a lot of shared challenges. So the key takeaways here are that the processor versus controller decision heavily influences what changes will be made. And those changes primarily will focus on policies and documentation related to the flow of information and data into and out of the archive. Organizations with parent organizations may face delays in finalizing their plans because they have to wait for the parent organization to make their own decisions. And the presence of internal expertise with both legal aspects of data protection and research data management is vital for this to be a relatively smooth and unproblematic process. Thank you.
One question for Allison. Yes.
Thanks. Thank you for presenting that to us. It's, I wish we had more PhD theses about our field to learn from. A lot of information in there. Thanks. One small little point on all of your slides, the question about, it looked like for some reason it was only one of the archives, but one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking is that question of how do we know if it's anonymized? There's de-identification, and then there's all kinds of layers of disclosure control. So if you could say a bit more about and it kind of gets to your question of, can we still archive? Was there any real angst about that? And what were the archives thinking?
So the question of anonymization was a pretty significant concern at all four archives. The biggest one actually was at IASSIST, because in Germany in particular, they've had this definition of what they call factual anonymization since 1989, based on the statistics law that came out that year, which defines something being anonymized based on essentially the amount of effort it takes to re-identify somebody. And for a long time, nobody within the German research community really thought that there would be a problem with that. And then leading up to the May 2018 implementation date, all of a sudden that kind of caused a lot of panic, because it looked like that definition of anonymization, which research institutions, including IASSIST, have been using for decades, would not be valid, which meant that a lot of the data that IASSIST in particular makes available would no longer be available. And what they thought would only be minimal changes could turn into this much bigger thing. And in that way, that decision was kind of settled in July 2018, with the German Data Forum basically saying that, yes, factual anonymization still exists, and we will, if you're a German institution, you can still use this definition, which is different from how the GDPR sort of defines it. And there are still a lot of differences in just what that means, but the data protection authorities in a lot of the countries have basically kind of set their expectations for it. And if the institutions have questions about it, they can go to them. And it's more a question of, really how anonymized is anonymized enough. And so for archives such as the Czech archive, where they don't have any sort of remote or secure access capability to provide access to pseudonymized data, for example, that does limit what the archives can currently do. So other than at the German or at IASSIST, most of the discussions I had about that were really focused on the limitations of what anonymization means in terms of what the archives in their current state can do. But there are always discussions at them about expanding their capabilities in order to make use of the like the pseudonymized data, for example. So it's an ongoing quandary, and everybody seems in agreement that anonymization, a perfect anonymization, is impossible, and you do have to balance the level of anonymization with the level of utility of data. So I don't know if that might have been a rambling answer to your question.
I'm afraid in order to go down, sorry, and find Allison in the break. She'll be ready, I'm sure.
Try to switch to this.
Okay. Because the thing is, now we have a little challenge. I think the next presentation will be virtual. So I need to find out who is sort of doing the presentation virtually. Oh, yeah, it's working. Great. I see it's working. Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, it's working on my screen, not on the other screen. So I call on all kinds of technical help. I guess it's because we can't see. Somebody's coming. Yeah, because just drag the window.
Yesterday, they shared their screen.
Yes.
And it's not working.
No, but it's not up here.
Oh,
That's the thing. We are sharing, but it's not shown on. Cameron, do you have any? At the moment, I can't even find the mouse because that is on here. Can I? Yeah, it's here. And what should I do? Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe stop sharing and then move to another screen.
Let's
Can we
see.
do that?
Multiple. Oh, what is that? No. You need a unionized professional.
Yes.
I put this in the chat. I don't know if you all can hear me, but I can also just share the link to the slides if somebody else is able to advance them. I can just.
Oh, make the presenter a co-host. Will that help? Maybe? That should help.
Here comes the one.
Okay, so I guess it's Rachel. Yeah. Let's just see you off. Now I made Rachel a co-host. More people I need to make a co-host. Karen, maybe.
You can use the filter. Oh, it's not
No,
there.
no.
What do you need to have?
Yeah, we can see the screen here.
Yeah.
That's one we want to show, but that's not shown.
Okay, so you have another presentation running. So just hit this share screen. So there's someone else sharing right now.
Yes, and that's fine. That's good.
Yeah, if they just stop sharing.
Thing.
Okay.
Oh, then we can.
And you want to show that one?
Nope, I wanted to show, and that's even not, it's not even here.
Have you started presenting?
That's a participant who started presenting, a Zoom participant who started presenting. A solution is on the way.
So this is the
This is not the presentation, no.
no. So the remote presenter, you're sharing the wrong screen. You need to share the presentation screen. You're sharing your notes.
No, but this is the last presentation, yeah. So that's,
Okay.
yeah, that's, yeah, this is working. Super, thanks. Okay, the Zoom participant can now see the right screen, but it's just us having a problem.
Screen to share. Is that correct?
No, no, it's the gray one.
This is what the Zoom participants.
Yeah, but that's wrong. Before it was right. That was the gray one. Sorry about this.
I'm confused. There's so many
Yeah.
windows.
I understand.
Okay, so is this a remote? Oh, sorry, I had to take it from you.
Yeah.
A remote person is going to present.
Yes,
Have they share the screen?
they have now sent a URL.
I don't need a URL. I need
okay.
the remote presenter to share the screen.
Rachel,
I'm
can
sharing
you
my
share
screen.
another screen?
Oh, do it again. Okay.
Yes,
Did that work?
now it's on. Oh, super. Oh, yeah, we'll avoid dancing this time, maybe next time. Yes, I'll just give the floor to Rachel Woodbrook that will take on the presentation. And please, Rachel, or maybe it's Karen. Is it Karen Downing?
No, it's Rachel.
Okay, good. Welcome. And please, a little bio on you as needed. And just take the stage. You've got it now.
Thank you. And sorry about that. All I can say in my defense is it is 1:30 a.m. here. So if I've done something that made it more difficult, I apologize. But I think mine is a little bit shorter than 15. So hopefully we'll still be okay. Yeah, so hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Woodbrook. I'm the data curation librarian at the University of Michigan, presenting today on a project creating a toolkit for data management throughout the data lifecycle in support of diversity scholarship. And before I started, I just wanted to quickly mention that I am presenting from land belonging to the Coast Salish peoples, including the Duwamish tribe, which is the host tribe of Seattle and King County. And although they signed a treaty in 1855, they're still working and fighting for official recognition by both the federal government and the city of Seattle. So I also wanted to give a big thanks to the sponsors who have supported our project, IASSIST via their Catalyst Fund, and then the American Library Association, their Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services, both helped us with funding. And I do also have a link to our entire team, past and present, on our website. But none of this, of course, would have been possible without them. And then lastly, if anyone does want to follow along, I put the URL to the slides in the chat. And so you should be able to do that. And I will mention as well, due to some circumstances over the last few months, we haven't made as much progress as I was anticipating. And so this presentation is pretty similar to a talk I gave a month or two ago at the Research Data Access and Preservation Summit. But just very briefly, the overall project, it was based at the University of Michigan Library, and it was conducted by several of us at the library in partnership with the National Center for Institutional Diversity, which is an on-campus organization supporting scholars doing diversity scholarship. And that's a term that they use and define as diversity scholarship is pretty broad as any scholarship examining and seeking to affect social issues such as identity, representation, repression, inequality at the individual, group, community, and institutional levels. So the first part of the project consisted of mixed methods research with scholars who were part of a network, diversity scholars network created by NCID, and reporting on those results can be found on our project website, and we're updating those as we go. But what I'll focus on today more was building the toolkit resource itself. And the basis of this project overall was a recognition that there's a disconnect between conversations and in some cases requirements around open data and data sharing, and then the support necessary for scholars to feel confident in sharing their data and to know that they've been able to take all the necessary steps to make sure they're doing this appropriately. And particularly at the time the project started, which was in fall 2018, there were almost no resources explicitly tying data ethics to the data lifecycle idea for data management purposes. And so that was the framework we decided to use for our project and thought would be most useful. And I'll have the lifecycle that we used a little bit later. But the overarching question shaping our project was, what implications do diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility considerations have for best practices in each step of the data lifecycle? In terms of building the toolkit, it was created to assist researchers. And so we selected resources to include based on feedback we got during the research phase of the project. We came up with parameters for the toolkit based on this, and we also did a literature search and an environmental scan of available resources that we could locate online. We ended up with about 60 to review, and we're continuing to add to this and hope to keep updating. Although we didn't see a correlation between any of the researcher demographics we collected and desires for specific types of resources, we do believe this kind of resource would be especially useful for scholars who are maybe earlier in their careers, who have fewer resources at their disposal, or who are not associated with an institution, or with researchers who have minoritized identities that might leave them open to greater scrutiny or consequences if they don't have that type of support. And so all of the resources that we included are openly available. So our goal was to identify the most useful resources and find a way to collate and make them available that was not overwhelming or difficult to wade through, so scholars could quickly and easily identify the resources that might be most helpful for them. And this is what the initial version of the toolkit looks like. It's not as visually appealing as I would like, but that's in the works. Revisions are. You can also explore it yourself. I'll drop that in the chat if I can as I present here. So anyone who has access to the chat, you should be able to, and it's linked from our website, our project website as well. You can see it's pretty basic. It's set up as basically a spreadsheet behind the scenes, and then we used Google Data Studio for the interface. We made a few pieces of metadata visible as filters, the data stages, the format, and then when it was last updated. And we also have a few other pieces of metadata, the creators of the tool, a description, and then why we chose it. And there's more in a spreadsheet behind the scenes that is also linked. And very briefly, I wanted to touch on a couple of the resources in the toolkit that were useful and how we chose things. So I'm going to take just a minute to show 2 examples of resources from the data sharing stage. The first resource listed here, the Data Ethics Canvas, is put out by the Open Data Institute, and it's a table that walks users through a series of questions throughout their project in table format to interrogate intention, potential uses, and the consent of research participants to consider when preparing data for sharing. And that this covers the range of the data lifecycle from the beginning of a project to the end. But it's a pretty flexible tool that researchers could start to use at any point. And then secondly, we have the Equitable Open Data Report. And you can see from this that in some cases we had to go outside academia to find good resources. Many come from a particular frame of reference. So this one is open government data. Many of them dealt specifically with big data. Most of the existing resources that we had found actually came from work around Indigenous data, which is specific to those communities, but also we've included some of those as good starting places for the types of questions to ask and models to use. So even when the resources were more specific than the general approach we were taking to data, they still included perspectives and questions that provide useful starting points for those in other situations. It was challenging to curate the resources to form a finished product. We took a multidisciplinary and introductory level approach. So there were many high quality resources that were very relevant to the issues we were looking at, such as traditional knowledge labels for metadata that were nevertheless too specific to include in a general toolkit like this. And then of course, there are some things that researchers undoubtedly need support on, such as de-identification, that were just too complex to fully address in this kind of a resource. But I do feel that we were able to come up with a number of useful resources for those looking for an entry point, or for those of us in data support roles, or librarians, somewhere to direct researchers when questions come up. And I will also say there's been more work on it in the interim since we started this project, but for a really good brief introduction to the topic of what the intersection of DEIA considerations and data management means, I suggest the resource that we indicate in the introductory paragraph for the toolkit, which is the Principles for Advancing Equitable Data Practice report from the Urban Institute. And that sort of takes the same framework we did in terms of looking at it across each stage of the data lifecycle and how it applies there. This is just the data stages model we used for our project. There were some linguistic challenges. We switched from calling it a data lifecycle to data stages, just because we were working with folks across different disciplines. And we also use this to organize the resources in the toolkit. We may use this actually as more of a visual entry point for the second revision of the toolkit. The spreadsheet is a little less user-friendly, and since we don't have as many resources as we anticipated, the filtering might not be as important as we initially thought it would be. So in that case, users could select a lifecycle stage, for example, data sharing, and then be directed to something more like a little web page where all of the metadata that we assigned are displayed. And this is very briefly a quick breakdown of the number of resources we have for each of the data stages that we were using. Our goal was to have sufficient representation across the data lifecycle, which was where we saw the gap in what was available. But of course, because of those gaps, it was much easier to find resources for some of the data stages rather than others. Although we were able to find the 2 stages that researchers most often indicated they thought were important but didn't feel comfortable with were data sharing and data archiving and preservation. And there was pretty good coverage for those. So if this is something that interests you or you think you would find useful, we welcome feedback on the content or structure of the toolkit, either directly to me or there's a contact point on the project website. Feel free to use it or to keep an eye on it as we update it. And we are hoping to make the full spreadsheet available with all of the resources we assessed, even the ones we didn't include in the toolkit, as well as a forum for suggesting additional resources. In the end, right now we have 17 resources total. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention is that you can see there are only 2 resources on finding data. That was an area that was particularly difficult to find resources that specifically were concerned with diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, although I think that's an area that's going to expand hopefully soon. And similarly, we did find very little available on accessibility of data as it relates to assistive technology. There's a larger conversation to be had there, and I think a lot of the principles of machine readability and good data practices in general lend themselves to accessibility, but there's still more room for development. So next steps, we're working on researching with interviewing scholars and some of our UX colleagues for feedback on this version. And then we're going to do a short survey with the original group that we conducted our survey research with, about 850 people, to get their impressions and suggestions on how useful the toolkit seems to them. And then we'll work on broader dissemination and incorporation, working with NCID as well. And I'm very excited to see where it goes next. This is a highly curated list. That was one of our goals, but I think a lot of the foundational work we did in terms of the literature review and the longer list could turn into something like a broader directory that would be manageable, that could be manageable and useful. But of course, one of the next things we're thinking about now is sustainability as well. This isn't meant to be a finished static product, though. I'm hoping that it will be a catalyst for conversations and interactions and a tool that people can build on where it's helpful for them in workshops and classes and things. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Questions for Rachel in the middle of the night? Yes, we got one here.
Thank you very much. We're thinking of doing something actually similar for education resources on data sharing. And so I would ask, how did you decide what metadata fields to choose to describe your resources?
Yeah, I think we didn't take a particularly methodological approach for that. We had sort of a emergent strategy where what we initially did, we had a lot of trouble initially locating resources and studies as well. Just there wasn't a lot in the academic literature. And so we were pulling together things from a lot of different areas. And so what we sort of did was a canvas of any resources we could find anywhere that seemed to be useful, and then looking across those for what the factors were that might help somebody decide whether or not it would be useful to them. So I think the thing that we've added that might be the biggest value add for folks is actually why we chose it, because the problem with a lot of these types of things is and this is what we heard in our research too, in our interviews, is just that even if you have a nice big list, it's so hard to dig down and find out what's useful for you quickly that it can be really overwhelming for people. And so we did that work. We looked at them in more detail and decided, based on maybe the structure of them, or I think in the presentation, we chose the data ethics canvas because it could be used at multiple points throughout the research without feeling redundant, and it had a clear outline. But I would say that it was an emergent way to put things together. And then as we went through and as we started to categorize them and do a little bit more research, we decided to add things like last updated, for example, because some of the resources are really good, but they aren't consistently updated, which of course is another problem with sort of online directories. I hope that answers.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you very much, Rachel. At least to the chair of the session, just this whole perspective is kind of new and very, very interesting. Thanks. We couldn't see you during the presentation. Do you have the possibility to take down your presentation and give a little wave, maybe?
Oh, yeah. Thank you all. I didn't realize.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you
Great.
for your flexibility too.
Yeah. Hope you get some sleep. Yes. Now we will move on to the next presentation, and that's Sharon Bolton from UK Data Services, and I'm sure Sharon will share her slides herself. This actually, this time it works. Oh, very good, very good.
Okay.
Thanks, good to hear you, Sharon. Yes, just a little bit of bio on Sharon, and this is for where you are three authors, and the next one is just you, but the bio from you. Sharon is the data curation manager at the UK Data Service. Oh,
Yes.
okay. Based at the University of Essex, UK. She has over 20 years experience in data and metadata curation and management and project work. In addition, Sharon leads the CESSDA I development team and also participate in the CESSDA Data Management Office project. And Sam is now fixing everything, which is really good.
Which is really frightening.
A bit frightening, but only for you, not for me. That's perfect. Oh, so you can see you. Oh, we got a Zoom expert in the room. Oh, let's look. Now we can see you while presenting and the dance. Very good.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie.
Yes,
Just to make things a bit easier, I've combined the slides from my two presentations, so I don't have to stop sharing in the middle or stop while I move to another presentation. So I hope that will make things a bit easier. It's lovely to speak to you all. I'm sorry I can't be there in purpose, but I hope you're all having a good time in Gothenburg. It's a lovely city. This morning, I'm going to talk first about some work that's in progress on the CESSDA Data Catalogue. And what we're hoping to do is make searching for data more effective. And once the work is complete, because it's ongoing at the moment, we hope it will help researchers find open data very easily across all the CESSDA members' data holdings. Okay, so here's some basic information about CESSDA for those of you who aren't familiar with CESSDA. Its full name is the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives, and it started in 1976 with just a few members. It became an ERIC, or a European Research Infrastructure Consortium, in 2017, and it currently has 22 member countries across Europe, both in the European Union and non-EU as well, and one observer. And and you can see there its aim is to provide research infrastructure across the community and to facilitate teaching and learning in social sciences as well. CESSDA funds services and products as well as project work too, and the CESSDA Data Catalogue, or the CDC, that's currently a CESSDA service and it's hosted on the CESSDA website. It's coordinated on behalf of CESSDA by the Finnish Social Science Data Archive at the moment, and it will be moving to control of the Slovenian Data Archive from next year, 2023. So CESSDA members are working together across this and across the other CESSDA services as well, of which else the European Language Social Science Thesaurus is one as well. Okay, so CESSDA Data Catalogue, it's effectively a portal. It's a one-stop shop. It's intended to be for searching and finding data, and you can see it hosted on the CESSDA website there. I won't follow any links today just because of time constraints, but all the presentations will be available after the event. And basically, the CDC provides access to the study level metadata records of the European social science data. So it's basically the catalogue records of CESSDA's national service provider organisations, and those are harvested for the CDC. It currently contains over 40,000 records, and it's in 11 languages and covers 20 of the 22 European countries. That's basically because a lot of the service providers send only their English language feed and not their local language feed as well, but it is available in 11 European languages. So, and it also, there's many kinds of data included in the CDC: quantitative, historical, register data, mixed methods, cross-sectional, longitudinal, and so on. And each catalogue record in there has an access data button, which takes you to the information about that study on the individual service provider's website. And we'll see that on the screenshot on the next slide. I hope you can see this okay. I would encourage you to go and have a look at the CESSDA Data Catalogue and just see what you can find there, how easy searching is and so on. I think it has a nice clean interface, and at the moment there are several filters included. These four on the left hand side, which is topic, date, country, and publisher, which is the individual CESSDA service provider who's provided the information. There's a multilingual search, and you can also see the languages that each catalogue record can be viewed in. In fact, these ones are only available in English, but there are multiple ones within the catalogue. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Access Data button, which will take you to information about how to get hold of that data on the service provider's own catalogue. Okay, looking at the search facilities, there's a basic search and an advanced search as well. And as we've just seen, you can apply filters. There's also quite a comprehensive user guide, so there's lots of options. And really, in creating the CESSDA Data Catalogue as a sort of multi-catalogue portal, we faced the universal question: if we build it, will they come? And obviously we want to make it useful to researchers. There's a proliferation of catalogues and portals all over the internet nowadays, and we want to make sure that this one really meets the user needs. So what we did was take some advice from CDC users, and one of the most outstanding things that they wanted was they'd really like to narrow down their searches to find open access data. People want to access data easily and quickly, and obviously it's not, this is not just aimed at expert researchers. We want to capture the next generation of researchers who are currently students as well, who might need, just access to a quick piece of data quite quickly, and they don't want to wait to be able to fulfill complicated access conditions. So we really want to add an open access filter as soon as we can. And looking at other CESSDA service providers, those who have instigated an open access filter, they found that significantly increased hits and data use of their catalogues as well. For example, the Finnish Social Science Data Archive have added one, and they found that has really increased visits to their catalogue. So the challenge that we faced was, how can this be done for the CESSDA Data Catalogue? Because obviously this isn't a catalogue with just one metadata provider. There are many different organisations. Okay, so each organisation has their own data access classifications, and obviously these can differ due to maybe differences in national legislation or the type of data deposit agreements that they have with owners. And if we want to include a search filter in the CDC so that users can easily select it, we really need to do some work to standardise that across CESSDA. So what we want to do is to try and bring the diversity of organisations together. And so we had to do some planning within the Metadata Office project to see how we could easily manage this within the CESSDA Data Catalogue, how we could work with service providers to try and create this filter. Okay. So under Metadata Office, what we did was some scoping work. So we looked at 2 large archives with varied data collections and different types of access. And this was the UK Data Service based in the UK and IASSIST based in Germany as well. And we developed a set of access types based on their access conditions. We tried to make this as simple and as harmonious as possible between the 2 archives, which we did have some fairly common categories, but there was some work to be done on this as well. And once we'd come up with a common set of categories, we wanted to see whether other service providers could harmonise their access conditions to these types. And as I said, there's multiple diverse organisations to consider and a few complications. The scoping work that we did to create the common vocabulary, or the common vocabulary between UKDS and IASSIST, led to a later project led by the Norwegian Data Archive, now known as SIGD, previously known as NSD. And they gathered feedback from CESSDA service providers and concentrated on creating a simple 2-type classification for the filter. And the categories that were chosen were open, where data were completely open and there were no restrictions on use or on user type either, and data could just be effectively downloaded very easily. Now, the second category, restricted, that really reflected any kind of condition that was attached to the use of the data. And that was right across the access spectrum, from maybe just simple registering a user account or an agreement to a user license, right up to strict, secure, remote or on-site access, secure access data. So we took all the various information that the service providers gave us and tried to put it all together. We had a set of DDI profiles have been created in the background to clean and harmonise the CDC metadata, and that was done under the Metadata Office project. Now, I have to say that I wasn't directly involved in the technical work, so if you have any questions about the DDI profiles, it's probably easier to contact the Metadata Office, and I'll give you the email address at the end of it. The profiles help validate DDI documents that the CDC receives from participating organisations, and profiles are available for several different flavours of DDI, 1.2.2, which is obviously the NESTAR feed, DDI 2.5, which is codebook, and DDI 3.2, which 1 or 2 archives are using, but it's DDI 2.5 is the most popular. And these are machine actionable XML documents, and they specify additional constraints over and above by that specified in the XSD schema. And basically they contain rules that metadata documents need to follow, and they have human readable information in them. For example, it will tell you whether the use of a DDI element is mandatory for the record, recommended or optional, and whether it uses a controlled vocabulary or not. And the CESSDA Data Catalogue uses the DDI controlled vocabularies, and there are multilingual versions as well available in another of the CESSDA services, the CESSDA Vocabulary Service, and that's at the URL given there. So the next step was to find a suitable DDI element within the DDI schema so that we could add an element to these profiles for the access type flag. Okay, so the DDI profiles as well, a little bit more on them. They support machine actionable validation by the CESSDA metadata validator, which again was developed under Metadata Office. And validation can be done by providing the individual records, or you can do a direct upload as well. And as I mentioned before, they ensure consistency in the CDC metadata records so that we can improve the metadata that goes in as much as possible and provide clean and categorized information for the search filters. And we've done quite a lot of work with service providers, and it's ongoing as well, to resolve any metadata issues that you may need help with. And I think it's quite important to say that the CDC term worked quite intensively with service providers where needed. Some organisations don't have the resources, obviously, to make quick changes or extensive changes to their metadata. So this takes quite a lot of time and support. Okay. However, at this point, when we were looking for a DDI element to go into the profile, we hit a slight hitch. Unfortunately, there is no DDI element for access type, which existed in DDI 2.5, and that's the schema that most service providers send their metadata in. So the CDC team contacted the DDI Alliance and requested an element for DDI 2.6, and that's been added, and the schema's going to be published soon. So although this has made a little bit of a delay, it has provided us with some extra time to consider the implications and to work with SPs on improvements as well. There are a couple of the schema already have CV elements. For example, DDI 3.3 has a CV element for the type of access. The Dublin Core DCMI has an element named access rights. And also an EU access classification exists as well. But when we looked at that, it was really more focused on documents than data access. So we felt the best way was to get an element added to DDI 2.6. Okay, so we've developed a common access vocabulary for the profile, which service providers can map their own categories to. And as I mentioned before, it is just the 2 flag one, open and restricted. And we're hoping to be able, once this is working properly, to be able to add more granularity in the restricted category later. We plan to add the filter as soon as possible, as soon as we can get hold of the DDI element. And we're really hoping that this will enhance the user experience and make the CDC a good research tool for finding open data. For example, the EU Open Science Policy encourages the use of open data, and it will help CESSDA to meet the FAIR recommendations as well, specifically R1.1, which is metadata are released with a clear and accessible data usage license, and F2, which data are described with rich metadata. So we're hoping that this will all help. So looking a bit further ahead into the future, hopefully with the access, once the access filter is added, the CDC is currently available in the European Open Science Cloud Marketplace, as well as on the CESSDA website. And the CDC team are also taking an approach of constant improvement as well to manage the service well. There's a program of regular technical releases. I think one is just about to be made very soon. There's a regular review of the DDI profiles as well. We plan to add more filters in the future, maybe as we can add to the granularity of the data access filter, and also look at different elements that where users may be able to search perhaps by methodology elements and so on. And as I mentioned before, there's ongoing support for service providers to improve their metadata, because really having their metadata in CDC creates impact for the individual organisations by widening their potential user community right across Europe and beyond. And depending on CESSDA's goals and future direction over the next few years, it is possible that we could include catalogue metadata from outside CESSDA in the CESSDA Data Catalogue as well. In fact, organisations that can provide a data endpoint that's currently compatible with the CESSDA Data Catalogue metadata model can be incorporated. So we hope that will be a real possibility. In the meantime, the CDC team are undergoing a programme of promotion to increase use. There'll be articles, conference presentations, and also encouraging service providers to feature a link to the CDC on their own websites and in their own catalogues as well. For example, Progredo, an organisation in France, have a link back to the CESSDA Data Catalogue on their website, and that we feel this route also helps route many of their users into CDC as well if they wish to explore a bit further. Okay. So, well, thank you very much. That's the end of the first presentation. And if you have any further information, if you need further information, it's probably best to contact the Metadata Office project at the moment. And this is especially so if you have technical questions on the DDI profiles and so on. My colleague Darren Bell, who's responsible for creating and managing the profiles, is actually at IASSIST in person this year. So if you have questions, if you see him and have a question for him, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer you. However, if you'd rather email us and send us details of your questions, please get in touch with Metadata Office. Okay, that's the end of the first presentation. So, and Sofie, I don't know if anyone has questions at this point, and I will try to answer them.
We'll see. Oh, I think we just go for the next, and then
Okay.
we'll have them all together
Okay.
in the end.
Yeah.
That will fit for time very well, I think.
Yeah, this next presentation is a bit shorter as well, so hopefully we'll do it on time. Okay, the second part of what I'm going to talk about today, we've already heard about the CESSDA Data Catalogue, and now I'm going to talk about some work that we did in the Metadata Office project to update CESSDA's data access policy, and that's really the policy that underlies the work towards standardising and harmonising data access. Okay. This is the standard slide on CESSDA again, so I will skip over that one this time. These presentations will be available as separate files after IASSIST, so there won't be as much repetition in them. Okay, now the CESSDA data access policy is a standard CESSDA document which is based on the CESSDA statutes, and it's available on the website, as are the CESSDA statutes. And it was first published and created in 2016. And it was really developed to provide a set of principles for CESSDA service providers, looking at common standards and how they could be established for the provision of data and metadata access across CESSDA. And it also aims to demonstrate CESSDA's commitment to open science, but obviously with a view to protecting privacy and intellectual property rights, and in conjunction with international and national legislation at the time. The first version, published in 2016, is available on Zenodo, and the new version will be as well when it's ready. And the basic structure of the data access policy is that it sets out 14 principles, and these are implementation notes are included on these to guide service providers in applying the policy. Obviously, CESSDA is full of diverse organisations, so the policy really has to be flexible and something that all service providers can try to work towards, and to also give some background as well as to why the principles have come about as they were. Okay, now in 5 years, a lot has changed in the data landscape, especially with regard to data governance. And by 21-22, the policy was definitely in need of update. And so under the Metadata Office project, we revised it to take account of all these developments. Not only were there new developments in legislation and standards, for example, GDPR and so on, We also needed to take into account needs and requirements for data access and any changes in those for the social science community as well. Obviously, the CESSDA Data Catalogue is developing, as we heard previously, and membership of CESSDA is growing, so the policy's got to remain relevant for every CESSDA member, really. And so it's got to be easy to apply. Okay, so the update process was really in 2 stages. We created the first draft and we prepared it for the CESSDA Service Providers Forum, which is a large meeting of all the different CESSDA organisations. And it was distributed at the meeting that took place in October 2021. And then after that, a draft was opened to service providers for consultation and feedback. We made a Google document which they could all comment on, and we were really, really grateful to get lots and lots of useful suggestions from them, and from all different kinds of organisation as well, which made us feel that, you know, we had a lot of information which to provide, which to create the next draft and to take on board their feedback. And I feel that certainly from my involvement in the process, I feel I really learnt a lot about how different organisations work and their considerations for this. We then took on board all their suggestions and created a final draft for the following service providers forum or meeting. They're held once every 6 months, and that was in April. And then again, we gave them a short period, was allowed for further comments and feedback. Actually, we didn't get a great deal, which I'm hoping signified that we'd actually done a good job in revising the policy, and most people were pretty happy with its final incarnation. So in May last month, we finalised the updated policy and submitted it to CESSDA main office, and it will next go to the CESSDA General Assembly meeting, which I believe is held later this month, and it will be ratified there. Okay. And after that, it will be published on Zenodo and replace the previous version. Looking at the new developments in the document, the things that we had to take into consideration were, obviously we had to incorporate the fair data principles, and we also had to include other external initiatives that CESSDA needs to comply with, which had arisen since the policy was first published. Firstly, the GDPR, and also the EU's open science policy, and CESSDA's own internal developments, such as the CESSDA PID policy. The PID policy states that service providers and certainly those who contribute towards the CESSDA Data Catalogue, now have to allocate a persistent identifier to their data items in accordance with the FAIR principles. And basically, if there is no persistent identifier, then the metadata cannot go in. We also had to take into account updates to the CESSDA statutes which had been made as new members had joined in the last 5 years. And obviously, as I mentioned previously, we need to update the policy to ensure that it's relevant across the whole range of different service provider organisations. So, looking at what's changed for the new version, we very much clarified and simplified the language and style in the hope that it's going to be readable and clear to people whose first language is not English. We've streamlined the number of principles down from 14 to 8. It's important to stress that they still cover the same elements: metadata access, data access and licensing. The FAIR principles are now explicitly enshrined in the principles: metadata harvesting, persistent identifiers and data access conditions. And obviously some of the new developments that inform the updated policy place requirements on the service providers. They must comply with the FAIR principles wherever possible, and the EU open science policy, as I've mentioned, GDPR obviously, and the CESSDA PID policy. Everything has been incorporated there. We've also added some flexibility in areas such as licensing, and this is really so that service providers have more flexibility in following the laws and practices in their own countries. And this really is a lesson that we learnt from doing the planning work for creating the open access data filter, in that some service providers did get a bit confused and think, well, if we were stipulating certain access conditions, did they have to renegotiate all their data agreements with data owners to fit into these new categories? And obviously that's not the case, but it made us think that we needed to be very clear and we needed to add some flexibility into the policy as well. Also, we updated and extended all the implementation notes that we added for each of the 8 new principles to make sure that we included as much guidance as possible on how to follow the principle for service providers. Okay, next steps. Obviously, it's awaiting ratification now by the CESSDA General Assembly, and then it will be published on Zenodo. And I mean, looking at it set out on a slide, it looks very sort of simple, but it was actually significant and lengthy work. It was actually very rewarding, because feeling that you were creating something that service providers could easily consider and implement was quite rewarding. And also it increased our understanding and application of the FAIR principles and how things could, looking at how the FAIR principles could be incorporated into all different kinds of archival practice and so on. So it was a very good learning experience for the Metadata Office staff concerned. And at this point, I must also thank Sharon Borszewski, formerly of IASSIST. She's now moved on, and she worked on the first draft update with me, which was a very significant update indeed. And she brought a great deal of metadata understanding to the draft, and really we couldn't have done it without her. And secondly, of course, but not least, we must thank all the CESSDA service providers who provided such good feedback in order to develop the policy. And we thank them, and we're very pleased with the end result and hope that they are too. Okay, well, this has been a much shorter presentation. Again, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask today, or if you prefer to contact the Metadata Office and write to us, that's fine too as well. Okay, well, I hope you found these interesting. It was very interesting work to do in both cases, and I hope that I've done it justice today. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen now.
That's super, Sharon. We have time for a few questions. So any questions in the room or in the chat, Cameron? You're checking, yeah, if there's anything. Yeah, we got one.
Just hello, just a general one about data catalogs. You've obviously got, you know, tons of functionality and ability for the users, but is it an ongoing challenge competing with Google and getting the users to come to the catalog in the first place?
Very much so, yes, yes. I think that's why the CDC team are planning to undertake constant improvement as much as possible. I mean, obviously it's depending on funding and resources, and also that's why we're undertaking such a big programme of work with the individual service providers who kindly send us their metadata. We want to try and make everything as consistent as possible. Again, promotion obviously plays a part as well, so we need to increase the visibility of the data catalogue. I mean, there's no point having this beautiful thing if nobody knows that it's there. But yes, indeed, it's a huge challenge, and it's only going to get bigger, I think.
Yes. More questions for Sharon? No, it doesn't seem like we're moving towards lunch here, Sharon. I just wanted to add that you said this policy work looks like it was simple. No, it doesn't. It looks like it's really, really complicated.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
really
great work, and it just reminds us all that how convergence on a sort of the policy level is sort of the prerequisite for getting to all the smart technical solution we can have for the data, the catalogs, and making fair data. We need to come along on the policy level first. That's really something. Yes, I think we'll end the session like here and go for lunch. And thank you again, Sharon. And
Okay, thank
we'll
you.
keep in touch. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Bye everyone for now.